The ink has faded into the grain of the fibers. The parchment has yellowed, curling at the edges where centuries of air have stripped away the moisture. You can see the tremor in the scribe's hand, the way the quill pressed too hard into the surface, leaving deep, jagged indentations that remain long after the pigment has turned to dust. These are not merely artifacts of a forgotten age. They are the physical anchors of a collective memory that refuses to settle. We touch the edges of these pages and feel the resistance of time itself. The words remain, locked in a rigid, silent formation, waiting for a reader to bridge the gap between their origin and the present. Every crack in the surface, every stain of oxidation, tells a story of survival against the inevitable march of decay. We approach these documents with a specific, quiet intensity, knowing that what we are looking at is not just a record of the past, it is a mirror. As we trace the lines, the ink seems to shift under the light, revealing a depth that defies the simple passage of years. We are looking for something in the shadows of these letters, something that has been waiting for us to arrive. The parchment holds its ground, silent and heavy. Why do we keep returning to these fragile, ancient lines? It is not merely for the comfort of familiar stories or the quiet of a sanctuary. We turn to these texts because we are haunted by the shape of what is to come. We scan the margins and the verses, hunting for a glimpse into the shadows that loom over our own era. Humanity has always looked to these sacred pages to find a map of the end. We see visions of fire, of empires crumbling into ash, and the final, absolute collapse of order. It is a strange, persistent hunger. We do not just read these words, we interrogate them. We look for the patterns of our own instability mirrored in the trials of the ancients. When the world feels brittle, when the foundations of our own society begin to shudder, we reach back into the archives of human experience. We are not looking for peace. We are looking for a warning. We want to know if the catastrophe we fear today was already whispered in the stars centuries ago. The ink holds the promise of an answer, and we are desperate to find it before the light fades completely. This is the sacred unease that haunts our collective memory. It is a quiet, persistent vibration in the mind, a feeling that the ground beneath us is less stable than it appears. We are here to investigate this phenomenon. We are not here to debate the tenets of theology or to weigh the truth of ancient claims. Instead, we are here to examine how these texts function as mirrors for our deepest, most modern anxieties. When we look into these pages, we see the reflection of our own instability. We see our fears projected onto the canvas of the ancient world. This is a study of the warnings hidden within the world's most enduring traditions. By the end of this journey, you will understand why, in times of global uncertainty, we return to these old pages with such intensity. We are looking for a sign that our current fears were already written in the stars. We want to know if the chaos we feel today is a repetition of a pattern that has played out countless times before. The unease is not a flaw in our thinking. It is the engine of our search. To understand these warnings, we must strip away the layers of time and look at the world that birthed them. The original context of these writings was rarely about the distant future. They were not composed in a vacuum of speculation, but in the heat of immediate, crushing suffering. Imagine a city under siege, the walls breached, the streets choked with smoke, and the debris of a collapsing civilization. Think of a people forced from their homes, trekking through dust and heat, their history being erased with every step they take. These texts were born from such moments. They were the desperate poems of a community watching their world dissolve. A local ruler turns corrupt, a harvest fails, a neighbor becomes an enemy. These were the crises that demanded a voice. Before these passages were feared as prophecies of the end, they were the living breath of people trying to make sense of their own survival. They were documenting the end of their world, not the end of time. Yet, in the act of recording their grief, something fundamental shifted. These poems of lament were never meant to be static. As the ink dried on the parchment, the personal pain of the author began to transcend the local crisis. A king falling in a distant province became a symbol for the collapse of all authority. The burning of a single temple became a template for the destruction of the cosmic order. This was the birth of the prophetic seed. The authors began to weave their immediate, visceral suffering into a broader tapestry of divine judgment. They were no longer just survivors documenting their own displacement. They were becoming witnesses to a cycle they believed was universal. The transition was subtle but profound. They took the raw, jagged edges of their own reality and polished them into symbols that could be applied to any age. The lament was no longer just a cry for help. It had become a blueprint for the apocalypse, waiting for the next generation to claim it as their own. Before these writings were ever viewed as riddles of the future, they functioned as the bedrock of the present. They were moral exhortations, designed to pull a fractured society back from the brink of internal chaos. When a leader strayed or a community lost its way, these texts served as a compass. They were not abstract philosophy. They were direct, practical instructions on how to live when the world felt unstable. Think of these pages as spiritual maps, drawn by those who had already navigated the wreckage of their own era. They outline the consequences of greed, the necessity of justice, and the heavy price of indifference. Every verse was a stake driven into the ground, marking the boundaries of acceptable behavior. They were meant to be read aloud in the marketplace, in the assembly, and in the home, serving as a constant reminder of the collective duty. By defining the difference between right and wrong, these authors were attempting to build a wall against the very collapse they feared. Then, the tone shifts. The practical language of moral guidance dissolves, replaced by a vocabulary of absolute ruin. We move from the marketplace and the assembly into the realm of the visionary, where the horizon itself begins to fracture. This is the entry into the apocalyptic, a space where the familiar rules of cause and effect no longer apply. The sky loses its permanence. The stars, once fixed points of navigation, are described as falling like withered fruit from a dying branch. The heavens themselves begin to roll up like a discarded scroll, leaving the world exposed to a void that was previously hidden. This is not a shift in geography, but a fundamental change in the architecture of fear. The authors abandon the human scale to describe a reality stripped of its foundations. It is a transition from the manageable problems of a city to the total dissolution of the cosmic order. The air grows thin. The narrative pace accelerates. We are no longer reading about the actions of men, but about the unraveling of existence itself. This new architecture of terror is designed to overwhelm. The ocean's surface begins to churn, not with the rhythm of the tide, but with the violent displacement of something massive rising from the abyss. The water turns black, thick with the silt of the deep, as the first beast breaks the surface. It is a creature of impossible geometry, scales clashing like grinding iron, its limbs dragging through the surf with a sound like tearing metal. It does not emerge to hunt. It emerges to claim the shoreline. A second follows, its eyes burning with a cold, pale light that cuts through the mist. The air grows heavy with the smell of brine and rot. These are not metaphors. They are physical, terrifying realities that force the observer to retreat. The waves crash against the creature's flanks, but it does not falter. It steps onto the sand, leaving deep, jagged impressions that fill instantly with dark water. The sound of its breathing is a low, rhythmic vibration that travels through the ground. This is the manifestation of the unraveling, a beast that embodies the chaos. It stands between the sea and the land, a sentinel of destruction, waiting for the final collapse of the order that once kept it submerged in the dark. The focus shifts upward, away from the carnage on the shore, toward the canopy of the night. The stars, once steady anchors of the celestial map, begin to flicker. They do not merely fade, they detach. One by one, they drop from the velvet expanse, streaking downward like burning fruit falling from a rotted tree. The silence of the vacuum is absolute. Then, the fabric of the sky itself begins to buckle. A seam appears, a jagged line of nothingness that tears across the zenith. The heavens do not break, they roll. Like an old, brittle parchment caught in a gale, the sky begins to curl inward upon itself. The sun is eclipsed. Gravity loses its grip on the world below. The horizon tilts, the mountains lose their definition. The stage is being cleared, the lights are being extinguished, and the world is left to drift in the void. The terror is not isolated to one scroll or one prophet. Across the vast geography of human belief, the architecture of the end remains hauntingly consistent. In the West, the four horsemen ride through the dust of broken empires, their arrival marked by the sound of hooves that shatter the silence of the plains. In Eastern traditions, the cosmic order dissolves like salt in a rising tide, where the very principles of existence are undone by the weight of accumulated karma. These are not disparate visions. They are variations on a singular, terrifying blueprint. Whether it is the fire that consumes the temple or the flood that erases the city, the symbols serve the same function. They are the scaffolding of our collective anxiety. They map out a world where the foundations have been hollowed out by greed and neglect. We see the same patterns of judgment, the same silence of the divine, and the same inevitable return to chaos. This shared language of catastrophe transcends borders and centuries. It suggests that humanity, regardless of its origin, recognizes the same signs of decay. We have built a global monument to our own fragility, using the same dark stones of fear to construct a narrative that warns us of our own undoing. The architecture is complete, and it stands as a mirror to our deepest, most persistent dread. When the foundations are stripped away, the collapse is not sudden. It begins in the quiet spaces between laws and customs. The moral fabric of a society is a tapestry woven from trust, and it is here that the unraveling starts. First, the threads of empathy fray. Neighbors stop looking into each other's eyes, and the common language of cooperation is replaced by the sharp, defensive dialect of survival. We see this in the way a city loses its pulse. The markets grow quiet, not from peace, but from a pervasive, creeping suspicion. The institutions that once held the weight of the collective, the courts, the schools, the centers of trade, become hollow shells. They stand in place, but they no longer function. The pillars are there, but the ground beneath them has turned to sand. People move through the streets with the frantic, aimless energy of those who have realized the map they were following is blank. There is no grand explosion, only the slow, grinding sound of a social contract tearing itself apart. The rules that govern the day are discarded. When the social contract finally disintegrates, the void is filled by the four horsemen. They emerge not as metaphors, but as the physical embodiment of a world reaching its breaking point. First comes the rider of conquest, a figure of unchecked ambition that turns neighbors into combatants. Then, the rider of war follows, leaving the field scorched and the city silent. Famine arrives next, stripping the grain from the silos and the strength from the bones of the desperate. Finally, death claims the remainder, a shadow that sweeps across the landscape with cold mathematical precision. There is a magnetic, terrifying power in these images. They act as a focal point for our deepest anxieties, drawing the scattered fears of a dying society into a single, coherent vision of the end. We cannot look away. Beyond the reach of human armies and failing cities, the vision expands into the dissolution of the cosmos itself. In Eastern traditions, the end is not merely a political collapse. It is the fundamental undoing of reality. The sky loses its color, turning to a bruised, hollow gray. The stars, once fixed points of guidance, detach and fall like withered fruit into a silent sea. The earth beneath our feet, which we assume to be solid, begins to lose its density, becoming porous and fragile. It is a terrifying architecture of erasure. The heavens roll up like a scroll, discarding the constellations that defined our place in the universe. There is no resistance to this process. It is a slow, rhythmic shedding of existence. The mountains flatten, the oceans recede into nothingness, and the very laws of cause and effect lose their grip. We watch as the fabric of the universe is pulled apart, thread by thread. The pressure mounts with every passing second. As the familiar boundaries of time and space dissolve, we are left with the chilling certainty that the end is not just a local event, but a universal necessity. The text remains fixed, yet the world around it shifts with violent, unpredictable speed. This is the mechanism of the prism. When we stand in the shadow of our own uncertainty, we look back at these ancient lines and see a reflection of our immediate reality. A passage detailing the fall of a forgotten king in a dusty, ancient world is suddenly pulled into the light of the present. It stops being a historical record and becomes a warning for a modern monarch. We are not reading the text, we are reading our own anxieties through it. The symbols are refracted, bent by the weight of our current dread, until they align perfectly with the news headlines of today. It is a psychological alchemy. We take the fire, the judgment, and the collapse of order, and we sharpen them into a blade that cuts through the safety of our daily lives. The warning feels tailor-made because we have shaped it to fit the contours of our own impending disaster. We ignore the original intent of the authors. The prism does not create the danger, but it gives the danger a name, a shape, and a terrifying sense of inevitability. We stare into these pages, convinced. History does not move forward in a straight line. It turns in a rusted, grinding wheel. When the plague arrives, turning cities into silent, shuttered tombs, the survivors do not look for new maps. They reach for the old ones. They see the blackened swellings, the empty markets, and the frantic prayers, and they find the exact same imagery in the ancient scrolls. It is a cycle of crisis that feeds on its own repetition. War follows the same path. The smoke of burning fields rises, the iron of swords clashes against shields, and the displaced masses crowd the roads. Every generation believes their catastrophe is unique, yet they find their own suffering mirrored in the accounts of those who fell centuries before. Famine acts as the final, cruel anchor. The soil turns to dust, the wells run dry, and the hunger becomes a physical weight. We are trapped in a loop of our own making, watching the same fires burn through different eras. The cycle is violent and relentless. The parchment is brittle, the ink is dark, but the warning is sharp as a blade. Consider the medieval monarch, sitting in a cold, stone-walled chamber while his borders crumble and his treasury empties. He does not seek counsel from his generals. He turns to the ancient scrolls. He finds the account of a king from a forgotten empire, a ruler who ignored the omens and watched his city burn. The text describes the king's arrogance, the silence of his advisors, and the final, inevitable collapse of his throne. As the monarch reads, the centuries between them dissolve. He recognizes the same rot in his own court. The past is no longer a distant memory. It is a direct, violent strike against his present reality. He closes the book, but the image of the fallen king remains, a ghost in the room, watching him wait for the end. The text does not change. The ink remains fixed, the characters frozen in its original ancient configurations. Yet, the terror within them is fluid. When a new catastrophe strikes, the human mind acts as a prism, bending the old words until they align perfectly with the present. We take a passage about a drought in the desert and see the climate collapse of our own century. We take a warning about a corrupt city and see the instability of our own global markets. The words are static, but the dread is tailor-made. Every generation performs this alchemy, stripping away the original context to reveal a mirror of their own specific fears. It is an act of desperate recognition. We read the lines and feel a cold jolt of certainty, convinced that the ancient author was speaking directly to our moment. The text becomes a vessel, hollow and waiting, ready to be filled with the anxieties of the living. We do not look for the truth of the past. We look for the validation of our current ruin. The catastrophe is not in the scroll, but in the way we force the scroll to speak our own language of survival. We are not uncovering history. We are constructing a prophecy. The warning feels modern because we have built it to be so, piece by piece, fear by fear. The motifs are consistent across the ages: fire, judgment, the beast, and the silence of the divine. These are the building blocks of our shared dread. We see the ruined temple, its pillars fractured, the stone ceiling collapsed into the sanctuary where the holy once resided. The silence there is heavy, broken only by the shifting of debris. Then, the vision expands to the city in flames. Smoke chokes the horizon, turning the sky a bruised, unnatural red. We watch the fire leap from rooftop to rooftop, consuming the marketplace, the archives, and the homes of the common people. The heat is palpable, shimmering in the air, distorting the silhouettes of those fleeing the gates. These images are etched into our cultural consciousness, burned into the mind like a brand. We see the temple walls crumble and the city streets turn to ash, and we recognize the pattern. It is not just a story of a distant past. It is a recurring theme in the human story. Now, the focus shifts to the balance. We watch the scales of justice, suspended in the void, holding the weight of our collective actions. For a long time, they hang in a precarious, trembling equilibrium. Then, the shift begins. A sudden, violent tilt. The pan containing the evidence of our failures drops, dragging the entire mechanism downward with a sickening metallic screech. It does not stop. It swings past the point of recovery, crashing into the abyss below. The force of the descent is absolute. We watch the chains snap, the metal links flying into the darkness, leaving the scales shattered and useless. In that moment, the illusion of justice vanishes. We are left with the raw, cold realization of our own fragility. There is no intervention. There is no correction. The weight of the collapse is too great to be countered by any human effort. We stand exposed, watching the debris of our order scatter into the void. The realization hits with the force of a physical blow. We are not the masters of this outcome. The scales have tipped, and the silence that follows is the sound of our own vulnerability. The ancient warnings now collide with the pulse of the machine age. We live in a landscape of constant, high-speed data, where information travels at the speed of light, yet the sense of stability remains as thin as paper. We stare into glowing screens, scrolling through endless feeds of global crises, and the ancient symbols reappear. The fire of the old texts is now the digital flicker of a collapsing market or a burning city seen through a satellite lens. We attempt to parse this acceleration, but the speed of change outruns our ability to comprehend it. A micro-turn occurs when we realize the patterns are identical. The beast of the old world is now the algorithm. The judgment is the sudden, automated failure of a power grid, and the silence of the divine is the cold, unresponsive interface of a global network. We are drowning in connectivity, yet we feel more isolated in our dread. The ancient text feels modern because the chaos is the same, only the velocity is increased. The warnings of the past are now amplified. We stare at the screens until the pixels blur, searching for a sequence that makes sense of the noise. Our fingers trace the jagged lines of stock market crashes and political upheavals, looking for the ghost of a prophecy in the data. We are desperate to find a pattern, a hidden rhythm that dictates the timing of the next disaster. Every spike in the graph is scrutinized as if it were a line of ancient scripture. We map the rise of a new conflict against the fall of an empire from 2,000 years ago, hoping the overlap is not a coincidence, but a map. A micro-turn occurs when the screen flickers and the data stream seems to defy our logic. We pause, breath held, then force the variables back into the mold. We are not just observing. We are constructing a cage of meaning to contain the chaos. We believe that if we can identify the warning sign, we can step aside before the blow lands. We ignore the randomness of the events, preferring the terror of a predestined end to the void of a world without a plan. We keep searching. We cannot accept that the world simply breaks. The thought of a collapse without a cause, a disaster born from pure, unscripted entropy, is a weight we refuse to carry. We demand a narrative. We insist that the falling of a city or the failure of a civilization must follow a script, a sequence of events that leads to a necessary conclusion. If the end is random, we are merely victims of a cruel, unseeing universe. But if the end is written, if it is a consequence of a moral failing or a cosmic cycle, then it possesses a structure. We find a strange, dark comfort in that architecture. A micro-turn occurs when we briefly glimpse the void, the terrifying possibility that there is no plan, no warning, and no meaning to the wreckage. We recoil. We pull back from that abyss and bury ourselves deeper into the ancient texts, forcing the chaos of our current lives to mirror the warnings of the past. We would rather live in a world that is being judged than a world that is merely drifting. We cling to the idea of a grand design, even when that design demands our own destruction. It is a desperate bargain. We trade the safety of a random existence for the cold, hard certainty of a story that has already been told. We are not just looking for signs. We are building a cage of meaning to keep the silence of the universe at bay. We must confront the silence of the authors. Historians remain locked in a stalemate, debating whether these warnings were meant for the immediate suffering of their own generation or if they were casting a gaze across the vast, dark expanse of millennia. Did they write for the city under siege in their own time, or were they speaking directly to us across the centuries? The truth remains elusive, a ghost in the parchment. Yet, a micro-turn occurs when we realize the intent is secondary to the resonance. These passages are masterpieces of human expression, capturing the raw, universal experience of terror, and the desperate hope for justice. They endure not because they are accurate blueprints of the future, but because they speak to the part of us that knows everything eventually comes to an end. We are not reading ancient warnings. We are reading a mirror. The fear we feel today, the trembling of the earth, the darkening of the sky is the same fear that gripped the scribe 2,000 years ago. We are part of a long, unbroken chain of witnesses, all looking at the same shadows, all waiting for the same final page to turn. Beyond the fear, there is a deeper, more primal hunger, the demand for ultimate justice. We look at the wreckage of our world, the inequality, the unchecked power, the suffering that seems to have no end, and we crave a final accounting. The ancient texts provide this. They promise that the scales will eventually tip, that the pride of the oppressor will be met with the weight of the divine. This is the climax of our collective dread. We do not just fear the fire, we wait for it. A micro-turn occurs when we recognize that our search for these warnings is actually a search for a judge. We want the world to be held accountable. We want the chaos to stop, even if the price of that stopping is the destruction of the order we currently inhabit. We imagine a moment where the ledger is balanced, where the silence of the heavens is finally broken by a verdict. It is a terrifying hope. We are essentially wishing for the collapse to act as a crucible, burning away the impurities of our time until only the truth remains. We are waiting for the final word. Consider the endurance of these lines. They are not merely relics of a forgotten faith or warnings of a specific collapse. They are masterpieces of human expression, crafted in the fires of survival and refined by the weight of centuries. When we hold these pages, we are holding a mirror to the universal experience of ending. Every culture, every era, and every individual eventually faces the same horizon where the light begins to fail. These texts capture that precise moment of transition with a clarity that modern language often lacks. They do not just describe the end, they inhabit it. A micro-turn occurs when we stop asking what the text predicts and start observing how it feels to be the one reading it. The imagery of the crumbling wall, the dry riverbed, and the silent sky, these are the shared vocabulary of our species. The masterpiece is not the prophecy. The masterpiece is the act of witnessing the end and refusing to look away. Perhaps the true mystery is not whether these ancient lines predicted our current age. The mystery is why we continue to return to them. We do not open these books to find a map of the future. We open them to find a witness to our own history. We are searching for proof that someone, somewhere, understood the shape of our fear before we were even born. It is a profound act of reaching across the abyss of time. When we read of a city falling or a sky darkening, we are not just observing a narrative. We are confirming that our current instability is not a unique failure. A micro-turn occurs when the distance between the ancient writer and the modern reader collapses. We realize that the hand that held the pen felt the same tremor in the air that we feel today. We are not looking for a prophecy to solve our problems. We are looking for a voice that says, "I saw this too." This is the anchor of our collective memory. We seek a witness who can validate our anxiety, someone who can confirm that the weight we carry is a burden shared by those who came before. There is a quiet, dark comfort in this realization. When we admit that our existential anxiety is not a private failure, the pressure begins to shift. We are not the first to stare into the shadows of uncertainty, and we are certainly not the last. This anxiety is a common language, spoken by every generation that has ever felt the ground tremble beneath its feet. It is the pulse of the human condition. By recognizing that our fear is mirrored in the ink of the ancients, we stop being isolated observers of our own collapse. We become part of a vast, unseen community of the concerned. The terror of the unknown is stripped of its sharpest edge. When we realize that the same questions have been asked, the same doubts have been felt, and the same silence has been endured by countless others. This is the secret utility of the ancient text. It does not provide a solution to the chaos, but it provides a mirror that reflects our own internal state. We find that we are not alone in our trembling. We are standing in a long line of witnesses. We are bound together by the very things we fear. The final page is never truly final. As long as the world feels unstable, we will keep turning the paper, searching the shadows for a sign. We look for a pattern in the dark, a whisper of meaning that justifies the struggle. But the ancient texts do not offer a conclusion. They offer a mirror. They show us that the story is not a static relic of the past, but a living, breathing sequence of events that we are currently writing. Every time we confront our own fears, we add a new line to the record. We are the latest authors in a narrative that spans millennia. The ink is still wet on the pages of our own time. We read the warnings of the past not to predict the end, but to understand our role in the middle of the conflict. The shadows we fear today are the same shadows that flickered on the walls of those who came before us. We are not just observers of this history. We are the ones holding the pen. When we close the book, the silence that follows is not an end, but an invitation. We step away from the text and back into the world, carrying the weight of the past as we navigate the uncertainty of the next hour. The story continues. It is written in the choices we make, the fears we face, and the way we keep walking forward when the light begins to dim. We are the witnesses now, and the page is waiting for the next word,